Now that we know how to start a new 2D sketch, let's talk about some basic sketch entities. There are several different things that you can sketch inside of your 2D sketching environment. The first couple things that we want to talk about are lines, circles, squares or rectangles, and arcs. Now you'll notice that each one of these tools has a drop-down. If you select the drop-down, it shows you some options. For line, we have a direct line, we have a center line, we have a midpoint line. Now if you select the line option, you'll also notice that inside of here in the Properties tab, we have several options. The orientation as sketched, we can lock it as a horizontal line, a vertical line, or a line at an angle. We also have a few other options for construction, infinite length, and midpoint line. To get started, we're going to create a new line from the origin off to the right-hand side. Now you'll remember in a previous video, I talked about the option where we can place a dimension by default. Now, we're not going to talk about dimensions in this video, but just note that I'm simply clicking the end of the line and placing it. Now, as we're sketching our line, we can carry on, so I can place multiple lines and just keep sketching. Now, the SolidWorks sketch tools have a nice feature where if you take your cursor back to the end point of the last line, it'll start by creating an arc that has tangency with the line you just sketched. Once you exit this, you'll notice that we're now back on the line tool. On your screen, you may see some faint yellow lines. Now these are snap lines that are telling you where the tangency or perpendicular relation is in relation to our arc. So let's go ahead and place a tangent line next to that arc. And again, we'll go back to that endpoint and we'll create another tangency. To end the line tool, you can either hit the escape key or you can double click the left mouse button. By double clicking the left mouse button, you still have the line tool active. You'll notice in the property manager area of your design tree, it still says insert line. Again, you can hit the escape key on your keyboard or you can hit the X to cancel out of it. So we've currently sketched a few things on the screen. Now let's talk about the next tool. This is a circle. Again, we have a drop down that shows you a few different options. The first option is a center point circle and the next one is a perimeter circle. 99% of the time you'll be using a center point circle, but you'll notice that when you start the circle tool, you can select between the two different types. It also shows you on the dialog what the selection process is. For the center point circle, we'll be selecting the center and then we'll be placing the radius. If we go to the 3-point circle, you'll notice that we're going to be placing all 3 points that are on the circle. It's just a different way to define the same geometry. And even though we define the circle by 3 points on it, we still have a center point. Let's go ahead and hit OK and get out of the line tool. You notice that after you finish, the circle or the sketch entity you've already created is still highlighted. If you simply select anywhere in the window, it'll de-highlight or deactivate it. You'll also notice on the screen that there are a lot of green boxes with different icons in them. These are sketch relations, and there's something that we're going to talk about in a later video, but I left them turned on so that we could see the relations as they were added. We can use the eye icon, go down to sketch relations, and turn them off so we don't see them. They're still there, and if you select one of the entities, it'll show you the relations that apply to it. It'll also show you it in the properties. But again, we'll discuss these in more detail in a later video. Next, let's talk about rectangles. Again, there's a drop-down and it shows you several different types of rectangles. If we simply select one, again, you can modify their type as you're in this dialog box. Let's start by using an endpoint or corner rectangle. You simply select one corner and the second corner to place the rectangle. If we want to use a center rectangle, you simply place the center of the rectangle and you drag it outward. So you'll notice that the difference between these two is that the center rectangle puts construction lines in here. Construction lines are very helpful adjusting your geometry without having to place too many dimensions. And there's a nice option with this. You have from corners or from midpoints. Let's place the same rectangle by using the from midpoints option. So you notice that this gives us the same rectangle and it gives us construction lines, but now we have endpoints and center points at each line segment. The other different types of rectangles do the same sort of thing. We can add construction lines, we can do from midpoints. You simply just need to use a selection process to create your rectangles. In this case, we have a center point, a second point giving the midpoint of one of the short lines, and then the third point is determining where the corner is. And the last is going to be a parallelogram. Again, this can come in handy, and it's really determined by the selection process and what you need your geometry to be. Let's go ahead and OK out of this and zoom out a bit. Next, let's talk about arcs. Using the drop-down, you'll notice 3 different types of arcs. We have a center point arc, a tangent arc, and a 3-point arc. Most of the time you'll be using the 3-point arc option, but let's look at all of them. Again, with this type of sketch geometry, you have options once you're inside of the properties dialog. Let's start with the center point arc. We simply place the center point, place a point on the perimeter, and we simply drag the arc around. Now you'll notice that by default, I'm dragging the open section around, but if you move the cursor back through it, you can change which way that arc is going. So you notice that when the cursor is outside, I'm creating a short arc. When the cursor is inside, it's creating a longer arc. So this can be hard to get used to at first, but you might just need to play a little bit with it in terms of where your cursor is in relation to the geometry. Next, let's do a tangent arc. We're going to be selecting our first point on an existing sketch geometry. You notice that it automatically creates a tangency here, and then we're selecting the endpoint. You notice that this tool, as we keep going, creates a tangency between all the other sketch entities. This can be a very handy way to start creating lots of sketch geometry. The last option is a 3-point arc. You simply select the start, the end, and then you select a point that's along the center line or the midline of the arc. Again, this is a great way to create geometry, and usually this is the option that you use when you start creating an arc. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the last thing I want to talk about, and that's going to be the fillet. Now the sketch fillet and the sketch chamfer are very handy, but in most cases you're going to be creating a fillet as a feature. They're easier to control and you can place them farther down in the feature tree. When you have to make edits, you don't have to go all the way back to the sketch. But let's take a look at creating a sketch fillet. I'm going to zoom back in on some of the initial lines I created, and I'm going to make a selection. So you'll notice if you hover the cursor over the center point or the end point of a line, that it shows you a preview of the fillet. You also notice that if I make a selection of 2 lines, it shows the same thing. We can also do a mask selection. So let's go ahead and right-click on our entities to create, and let's clear the selection. If you select an endpoint that is common between 2 lines, this will create a fillet for you. So let's go ahead and create an endpoint selection, and then we also created a 2-line segment selection. We get the same result out of both. You can also use the dialog arrows to move up and down and change the fillet size. Now I should note that the default size is going to be 10 millimeters, or if you're using an inch template, 0.1 inches. So every time you hit the up arrow, it'll increment by that. You notice that when we go past 20, we no longer can do this because it would completely remove this line segment. We can also manually enter values. We wanted to make a small fillet or a larger fillet. You also notice a few options below this. We have keep corners constrained, which is very handy, especially since we have line segments that are going to be trimmed and removed. We also have dimension each fillet. This can be handy if you need to go back and manually change a dimension for just one of the fillets. If this option is not selected, the dimension placed in the sketch will control all fillets created within this dialog box. Let's go ahead and say OK. You'll notice that we have 2 dimensions, one for each fillet. If we double click on those dimensions, we can modify them individually. When we're modifying these dimensions, go ahead and drag the dialog out of the way. You'll notice some options. If we hit the rebuild icon, it'll rebuild it on the screen for us. If we manipulate this value and simply say OK, it'll rebuild it after we OK the dialog box. The rebuild option can be very handy while you're creating your sketch to see what changes will look like. Let's go ahead and add chamfer. Again, you can select a point, or you can select 2 line segments that have intersecting edges. You'll notice that it's dimensioned to the point or the reference that's still there. And you'll notice that we do have some options. Do an angle and a distance, or a distance. You'll notice that when we use distance, we can select or deselect the equal option. For instance, if it wanted to be 15 millimeters in the first direction and 10 in the second, we can manipulate that. You'll notice that currently this is locked because when we created the first chamfer, it locked these 2 dimensions together. We can right-click and unlink those values. So now I can create 10 millimeters in one direction, 15 in the other. So now we've taken a look at some of the basic sketch entities that you need to use when you start creating sketches.